America, the land of freedom and opportunity, home to some of the most inspired culture, finest cuisine, and lots of other stuff that makes plenty of people say, I'm proud to be an American. But even the great old USA, Stars and Stripes, the soaring bald eagle, insert other patriotic references here, has had its moments of being overshadowed by the culture of another. And in perhaps the most prominent example, we defied the founding fathers, unable to resist the allure of the very country we originally declared our independence from, resulting in the British invasion. But first, while we're on the topic of invasions, when it comes to an invasion of privacy, this video's sponsor, Surfshark, has got you covered. When you use Surfshark's virtual private network, or VPN, all of your data and personal info online is encrypted for you while you browse, so you can be sure that all of your activity stays private. Sensitive data like emails, credit cards, and passwords that can easily be stolen without a VPN all remain safe and unstolen with Surfshark. Ads, viruses, and malware all get locked away behind Surfshark's secure encryption, while geo-locked content on streaming services becomes unlocked. By choosing any of Surfshark's server locations across 100 different countries, you can access shows and movies that are normally only available in certain regions without any restrictions. Enter my coupon code DREAMJELLY at the link in the description or using the QR code on screen, where you can get an extra 4 months of Surfshark for free. With a 30-day money-back guarantee, there's no reason not to secure your privacy and browse the internet the way you want to. Thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring the video, and now let's get back to seeing what exactly happened with that British invasion. Back in the 60s, there was this little band, pretty indie and underground, you've probably never heard of them, called the Beatles. Once their music reached America from Great Britain, they brought with them a gradual and overpowering movement known as Beatlemania, and it was crazy. It was hard to listen to the radio without hearing one of their dozens of Hot 100 hits, or turn on the fancy color television set without seeing them dancing around, winning over teenage hearts. And although their mountains of fangirls and overall pop culture presence was impressive, they weren't the only British band to make it big. They were just the start of the beginning. Over the years, more music, movies, and fashion all contributed to a huge wave of infatuation with British culture in America. It wasn't like anything that had ever entered the US before, and that seemed to be most of the fun of it. Mod fashion, British leading actors, new takes on pop and rock music, and probably a lot of people who just liked the way they talked, all made enough of a cultural impact to put a name to the phenomenon and coin the phrase, the British invasion. The first official trend died down as the decade progressed into the 70s, but in the 90s, a so-called second British invasion took over the US music charts through artists like Spice Girls, Oasis, Radiohead, and Robbie Williams. And there are even mentions of a third British invasion in the 2000s, where even more British artists charted in the US, like Amy Winehouse, Jay Sean, Natasha Bedingfield, and Leona Lewis, just to name a few. But that was back then. Your distinctly American voice likely chimes in. America doesn't care anymore about all that British stuff now. In the digital age, pretty much everything in America and all over the world has been affected by one international influence or another. Except NASCAR. They could never take you away from us, NASCAR. But I mean, we get it. British stuff exists. Do we really need to keep calling each surge of new media and artists with their funny accents another British invasion? Well, if it were up to me, yes. Because among the first, second, and third of these invasions that are chronicled through the decades, there is still one more era of pop culture that is left uncatalogued. Largely influenced by British trends, media, and music, I strongly believe that it also deserves to be documented in the history books. Or at least documented on my YouTube channel, which is close enough. What's the big idea? What's so special about this fourth iteration? Well, I'm so glad that you asked, my American compatriot, because this more recent period is actually distinctly different from those that came before it, which is mostly due to a new element thrown into the mix: the internet. Sure, the internet did exist during the 90s and 2000s, but since then it has transformed into a space all its own, no longer just hosting culture, but creating and containing its own. And I come to you with the perspective of being not just a teenager during this fourth invasion, not just a fangirl, but a teenage Tumblr fangirl that was chronically online throughout its lifespan. I directly witnessed, experienced, and participated in this phenomenon, and I think it's about time that we all accept this period in time as the most modern and recent wave of British culture in America and beyond. The British invasion of the 2010s. And what better place to start than at the beginning of both the decade and the phenomenon with what started it all. With each individual invasion, it's true that there was no singular piece of pop culture that defined the entire trend. Each case is so prominent because they're each a collection of a bunch of smaller individual points that feed into each other and run together and just end up mashing into one big British amalgamation. With that being said, though, in the 60s, the Beatles weren't just one of the biggest bands of the decade, but they're credited as being the catalyst that began the entire movement. They were young and trendy and captured the hearts of millions of girls that swooned at just the sight of their matching bowl cuts. Other boy bands have come and gone since the reign of the Beatles, but none have been quite as explosive, influential, and British. None except for one. Direction. One Directions. The boy band, they're one. They're like the same as the Beatles. Hold on. Before you post that very opinionated and offended comment that you may or may not be writing, let me just say that I'm not making any statement about the actual music or artistry of either group. This channel is a 1D fan safe space, but everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Either way, whether you like them or not, when you look at the big picture, the similarities between One Direction and the Beatles are undeniable. Their quick rise to fame, the boyish charm, their overall Britishness, and they of course both had their army of fangirls that were maybe a little too rabid, putting themselves in dangerous situations and otherwise just embarrassing themselves in the name of a boy band, which I'm allowed to say because I was one of those embarrassing fans myself. All of these points prove the fact that One Direction effectively acted as a direct modern parallel to the Beatles, and they served as a similar catalyst for the new British invasion of the 2010s. Relics of the overwhelming force that was the One Direction fandom in its prime during the 2010s can still be found floating around online, invoking strong emotions, puzzling uninitiated bystanders, and defining an era of the chronically online and boy band obsessed. Sure, the Beatles were big for their time and may have had a larger lasting impact overall, but Beatlemania didn't have the means to create anything like this. Or this. Even though maybe that was for the best. Even though some images may be disturbing or difficult to understand, these archives help represent just a fraction of the power One Direction had over their audience and how much of a hand that played in inciting the modern invasion. It was truly an amazing time to be alive. Though it is worth noting that One Direction wasn't just the biggest boy band of the decade that also just happened to be British. Their popularity, to a certain extent, directly coincided with their foreign charm. Of course, as a veteran 1D fan, I'm sure my stance here is a little biased, but as I look back through their history now, it's even more clear to me that pretty much all of their marketing in the early years was centered around their nationality. From subtle tie-ins like lyrics about drinking tea, to the slightly less subtle traditional English imagery used in their albums and music videos, to the very non-subtle use of the Union flag on their merch and promos, they wanted us to know that they were a British band, because just like with the Beatles, that was a major part of the appeal. I think maybe the best example of how much their nationality was used as a marketing tool is how, for the first couple of years, One Direction was almost constantly dressed in the colors of the Union Jack, so that if you saw them, even if you couldn't hear their accents, you could still see the Britishness, subliminally. Sure, these colors aren't exclusive to just the Union flag, flag, but in this case, I think it's safe to say that that's the vibe they were going for. I must have missed this effort when I was younger, probably too busy drawing cringy pictures of them to be effectively targeted by the marketing. But now I see that they weren't just representing the flag. They were the flag. Red, white, and blue. Like a giant, unnecessary circle and big red arrow that's slapped on a YouTube thumbnail, pointing out that, hey, they're British. My point here is that all of this is relevant not just because I like to click through a bunch of pictures of 2012 One Direction for video references, but because it really drives home the point that as one of the era's most popular artists, their nationality, 4/5 nationality, sorry, Niall, played a big role in their success, just like with the Beatles, and it helped bring with them a new wave of British adoration from their international fans. Even though their popularity was almost unmatched at the time, that's not to say that One Direction was in any way the only British music artist that had a rise to fame in the 2010s. Ed Sheeran, Adele, Jessie J, Ellie Goulding, The Wanted, Charli XCX, and Tayo Cruz all emerged with hits that made them among some of the biggest rising artists of the time. So clearly, the music industry was heavily affected, but beyond One Direction, how could a few hit songs create such a large movement, especially when international artists in general weren't exactly anything new? Well, unlike Beatlemania, fans of British culture were no longer limited by what physical media they could get their hands on. Now, the internet was a place where they could get their hands on pretty much anything and curate the exact kind of British experience that they wanted. As far as movies and TV went, the 2010s was full of British-based media. Sherlock and The Great British Baking Show both first aired in 2010. Skins started on its 4th season, while modern Doctor Who launched into its 5th. And Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, the final climactic installment in the movie franchise, released in 2011. And those are just some of the big ones. Naturally, with so much going on, Tumblr was a hotspot of British obsession, particularly around Sherlock, Doctor Who, and Harry Potter, whose fandoms all made up some of the biggest activity on the site. If you've never heard the phrase super Wholock before, then I envy you. But it was essentially an amalgamation of some of the most vocal, dedicated, and overbearing fans of Tumblr's 3 favorite shows. Supernatural wasn't a British show, but it completed the package. It's hard to describe exactly the kind of presence that these fans had online at the time, but one way to put it is that they were everywhere. Even if you had never actually watched an episode of any of these series before, you probably at least knew who the main characters were, their names, and what they looked like, just from residual knowledge of always being surrounded by it. Being online, especially in fandom space during this time, was like being amidst a constant barrage of British media and its fans who are all very passionate about why you should like it too. Benedict Cumberbatch's deep voice and absurd name were too perfect of a combo for him to not be deemed a Tumblr sexy man. Matt Smith's portrayal of the 11th Doctor was quirky, and he wore fezzes and bow ties. I mean, even the memes were British, with Keep Calm and Carry On being one of the most popular macros of the decade. And when only fictional British personalities and universes weren't enough, there were always the British YouTubers, which also saw a surge of popularity in the 2010s, and got a pretty similar treatment as far as obsessive fans went. TV shows and movies were great for entertainment, but anecdotes from the real lives of British people contributed just that little bit more to the fascination with not just their media, but their culture. Creators like Dan and Phil, Zoella, Alfie Days, Marcus Butler, Charlie Is So Cool Like, and plenty more, all made videos talking about or showing off their lives, and it gave just that much more insight to what it was actually like to be British, which, when paired with the rest of the effects of the invasion, seemed like the coolest thing ever. To put things in perspective, YouTube in the beginning of the 2010s was only just starting to reach the point where you could actually do YouTube as a job. And while there were plenty of popular creators that had garnered successful careers, videos with sit-down style vlogging and the now infamous storytime format were only just starting to gain a wider audience. In the absence of modern-day influencers like the ones that exist now, YouTube vloggers weren't just filling in the pre-influencer market, but kind of creating it. And what's even better than watching someone from your own country talk about their day and tell funny stories? Watching someone from a different country telling stories and talking about their lives, but now in a cool accent. The vloggers of the 2010s were among the first iteration of online influencers, and the appeal for even more British content was only growing. I think this is where the modern British invasion really started to actually invade, so to speak. Because it's one thing to be interested in popular shows and movies, or to be a fan of a super popular boy band, but it's another thing to idealize the real, actual lifestyle of British people, instead of just their pop culture. The stories told by these YouTubers, however exaggerated they were for the sake of entertainment, were their real experiences. They talked about tea, Tesco, easy access to public transport, and all kinds of other foreign things that fascinated the international members of their audience. Now, it wasn't enough to just like British culture. Plenty of young, impressionable American teenagers were convinced that it would be even better to just actually be British themselves. It even reached a point where people were using British slang and phrases amidst their otherwise very American vocabulary, completely unironically, just because they thought being British was that cool. I cringe to think about a 14-year-old Dream Jelly casually calling the trash can a rubbish bin, or substituting the word crisps instead of chips, but I really did that. And I wasn't the only one. I think it's safe to say that a lot of us are still in recovery even to this day, occasionally slipping into a poorly imitated English accent or busting out words like bonnet and holiday for absolutely no reason at all, aside from the cringy dialogue, and of course actively consuming your favorite form of British media, what was arguably the most popular way to really show everyone that you had British fever, or whatever you want to call it, was, of course, through wearing anything printed with the Union Jack. The 2010s were admittedly already a pretty dire time for fashion, where galaxy print, studs and spikes, mint and coral as a color combo, and statement necklaces were somehow all popular right around the same time. I have no idea how we survived. But since there was already so much going on, the popularity of the Union Jack seemed to just fit right in, and it was on everything. Jewelry, studded shirts, clasp wallets, toms, low-rise dark-wash denim shorts, all the staples of the decade. Plenty of other British imagery like Big Ben, double-decker buses, and red phone booths were also pretty popular, but nothing was really worn and displayed like the flag. It's not like the 2010s invented the idea of printing the flag on stuff, but it definitely did take it beyond mostly only being used on London souvenirs and Spice Girls outfits. And once it reached that point of mainstream fashion, it wasn't even about the fans of British stuff anymore. The fascination had officially invaded pop culture to the point where it was incredibly trendy to just wear a Union's flag because it looked cool, even if you didn't know what a One Direction Imagine was, or had never reblogged a Doctor Who gif in your life. It had transcended fandom and become its own fashion symbol, like it was just a cool pattern or something. If that's not evidence enough to label the whole thing as the fourth British invasion, then I don't know what is. Naturally, like all trends, the British invasion of the 2010s eventually came to a close, and all the hype surrounding their fun accents, trendy flag, and World War II posters turned memes tapered off as the excitement died down. Nowadays, artists like Adele, Ed Sheeran, and Charli XCX have continued to grow into huge careers, but the music industry isn't as cornered by British artists as it once was. In 2024, One Direction's year-long hiatus is on its 8th year. Super Hulock isn't much beyond just a word that triggers old Tumblr flashbacks, and most of the other British stuff is back to being just that. British stuff that doesn't have any substantial or otherwise out of the ordinary effect on any other country. Maybe you can tell, but I'm definitely particularly nostalgic for the 2010s just because I was so heavily entrenched in all of the things that defined the state of pop culture at the time. Being an online fangirl really hit different. I'm curious to know if anyone else has similar feelings about it all, or if there are just as many people who didn't subscribe to any of the British infatuation and maybe learned something new from watching this video. maybe you just missed the 2010s as a whole, even if people were wearing galaxy print and statement necklaces. All I know is that even if it wasn't the first, the fourth British invasion was unlike any of the others that came before it. And even if there is eventually a fifth wave that comes along later on, it'll be pretty hard to top. Hi, welcome to JellyTV, where I shout out a video that I think deserves some love. I recommend watching The Dumbest Lawsuit in Flash Game History by Slow Start. This video covers the legal battle between a Newgrounds animator and Nike that's based entirely around the intellectual property of a stick figure. I love niche internet lore like this, and Slow Start covers all of the best parts of the saga with a really articulate script and super fluid editing. Even if you're not very familiar with Newgrounds or Flash games, this video is worth a watch to get the whole story. A huge thank you to Daniel E. from ABQ, Kevin Evans, Bunzo, Eliza, Vindicano and Irise, Grayson, Hasta Luego Luca, Hayden Campbell, Johan Ake, Lojwa Animal, Lou, Lucy Likes Tegan and Sarah, Luna Stephenson, Mark Kent, Paper Sam, Fromamags, Shaples, Starbit Illustrations, Theodore Nicolawilius, Vivian Valencia, and the rest of my patrons for supporting me. Hello, governors. This is the British Patreon end screen where we drink tea, think about how much we love fish and chips, and only listen to One Direction. Make sure to say pip pip cheerio and pick up a virtual souvenir flag on your way out.